Good afternoon, friends, and welcome to CBF Conversations. I'm your host today, Stephen Reeves, and I serve as Associate Coordinator of Partnerships and Advocacy for the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship. We're glad you've joined us. We are excited to bring you stories from the fellowship of folks doing work to renew God's world. Today, we have a conversation about the role of pastors and ministers in advocacy. This is part of CBF Conversations, a new series of live and recorded video discussions on faith and culture topics for the benefit of Christians and congregations. You can find recordings of previous conversations and the schedule of upcoming conversations at www.cbf.net/conversations. As we get started, I want you to know that you have the opportunity to ask questions of our three panelists. If you were on Facebook, you comment in the panel on the right, and we'll attempt to get to some of those questions throughout our conversation. I can't promise we're going to get to all of them, but we'll do our best. I'm really excited to welcome three friends to this conversation today about the role of advocacy. They're going to bring a unique perspective, but they're all three very much committed to advocacy and doing that work within the local church. And so our first panelist I'll introduce is Steve Wells. He's the senior pastor of South Main Baptist Church in Houston, a longtime friend and strong CBF pastor. He's also a Baylor guy. I think you have, 3 degrees from Baylor, Steve?
I couldn't get anywhere else.
I was wondering if you could get some more, if they were allowed you to have any more of those.
Got the limit.
But Steve's been involved in advocacy efforts, especially around predatory lending and some other things. And so I'm happy to have him join us today.
Thanks for having me today.
Thanks, Steve. Our next guest is Elisa Aldape. Hey, Elisa, thank you for joining us.
Hi.
Elisa is Associate Pastor for Young Adult and Youth Ministries at the First Baptist Church of the City of Washington, D.C. And she is no stranger to CBF. She's the child of field personnel, Eddie and Macarena Aldape, who are currently serving in Spain, but Elisa spent a lot of her life growing up in India. She's a Sanford and McAfee grad with family roots down along the Rio Grande Valley in Texas. So thank you, Elisa, for joining us today.
Glad to be here today. Thanks, Stephen.
Thanks. Last and certainly not least, my friend Danielle Ayers, who has the coolest title of anybody on this call. She is the Minister of Justice at Friendship West Baptist Church in Dallas, Texas. But let me tell you, she has a lot of roles because she is also the co-convener of the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference. And if you want to see the cutting edge, prophetic, justice-oriented ministry in America, and particularly in the Black church, you need to know about the Proctor Conference. She is also on the advisory board of the New Baptist Covenant. She's a graduate of Bright Divinity at TCU, and she's the co-author of To Serve This Present Age, Social Justice Ministries in the Black Church. And so I want to commend this book to you. She's very talented and very much an expert in this area. Thank you, Danielle, for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, I'm really excited to have this conversation, and I want to say this is the second in a 4-part series around advocacy in the local church. That's part of sort of the release of a new resource for churches from CBF, and that is this book, The Mission of Advocacy, a toolkit for congregations that I co-authored along with Katie Ferguson Murray of Wilshire Baptist Church. And so this book tries to help folks in churches make that leap from charity to justice, from missions to advocacy. And so we want to talk about how that's done and kind of the role of the pastor and the church minister in that transition. And I have to say thank you again to Danielle. Her book was very helpful in writing our book, and they're very similar in many ways to our unique particular context. So thanks, Danielle. It's a good book too. I want to start by talking a little bit about some of the things that I mentioned in the book and hear some of your feedback. And having worked in this intersection of policy and religion, and with churches for many years now, I know that sometimes if you want to get some things done at the local church, you actually don't start with the pastor. You start with the laity, you start with the deacons, the Sunday school teachers, those little old ladies who show up every single time the door is open. That's sometimes how you get things done. In this case, however, I think it's really important to have the pastor model and affirm the work of advocacy as part of the life of the congregation, especially from the pulpit. But I also think pastors have a unique role as a community leader in advocacy when they go outside the church walls. And in the book, I talk a little bit about two types of advocacy that overlap, but I think have to be part of a strategic thinking especially for pastors when it comes to stepping into this role. One I call engaged advocacy. That is the long inside game lobbying policy effort built on relationships of long time and trust. The other is expressive advocacy, and I think we have a lot of that going on right now, of protest, of demonstration, of kind of speaking truth to power, that sort of advocacy. And I think they're both necessary at different times, but they're both necessary. And so I would love to hear you all talk about those 2 points, and whether you think I'm on the right track, or whether you have other ideas about kind of the role of the pastor in advocacy. And so, Steve, we'll go ahead and start with you.
I was going to defer to Danielle because I think she has a lot to tell us there. Sometimes I think those things come to a point of intersection. So in the course of the last year, what has been a long set of relationship building, which started really in 2011 and some hunger for seeing some racial unity in our city. And in 2013, in the work that you and I did together, that got, by that, I mean, he suckered me into doing work on payday lending. And then you see it and you think this is the most horrific moral evil, and it's right here in our city, and why aren't we doing something about it? And then you can't get out. And then some relationships that came out of that. So that this year, the shape of my ministry changed a lot because I was asked to speak at the George Floyd service. And what came out of that then, and we're happy to talk about that later, but what came out of that then was 2 opportunities to serve in the city on the mayor's task force on COVID response, and then on the mayor's task force on police reform. And part of what I want to say about that is that there were 4 ministers on the mayor's task force on police reform. Bishop James Dixon from the Community of Faith Church, Bishop Andy Doyle, the Episcopal Diocese of Texas, Rabbi Gideon Estes, and we were asked to write the moral and ethical framework for police reform. Like, why should people in the city care about this? And I say that only to say that in the 4th largest city in America, the assumption was that the clergy would have something that everyone in the city needed to hear and understand, that there would be a compelling point of view driven toward action, and that the church, that the faith community was the natural place to look for that. So that expressive side of advocacy led into the policy side, because what follows after that is what concrete changes do we want to see in the way policing happens in our city. Anyway, I think those 2 things work together, and I think it happens because pastors still, with all of the other crazy going along in our world, pastors still have a perch of responsibility and a vantage point, a pulpit that faces the city, if you will.
Thank you, Steve. That's a great example. I agree that they go hand in hand and often can lead to one to the other. Elisa, I know you've been involved in some advocacy and justice work there in Washington, D.C. What do you think about that kind of distinction and that role that you serve?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think you can't have one without the other. So I moved to DC about 3 days before the election in 2016. And so my experience in the city of Washington has been, it's been different than what I was expecting. However, it was a big wake-up call, I think, for clergy and people of faith or faith leaders to ask themselves, what are you going to be about? Not just saying, well, I love Jesus. Like, okay, yes, we all love him, but, how are you going to express that in how you live your lives? And so, in DC, it is very easy to join protests. You pick up some cardboard, write down what you want to say, and you meet up with people and you you express, you name the injustices that are happening, right? And we need that, and we need people who say this is not okay. This is not okay. As a person of faith, we know that Jesus, flipped tables and said, "How dare you get out of here, you den of snakes." However, I think about it's in the details as well. Living in DC with not without having the same representation as people in other states do, realizing just how important working on policy and really working in the details of that aspect of advocacy is just as important, if maybe not more important. I think in the work, and I think that pastors have a really great responsibility and advantage. I really love that phrase of where our pulpits face, advantage of reminding our folks that, Jesus and the minor prophets didn't just proclaim out what needed to be done, but they did it to the leaders who were making those policies and making those changes. And so for me, I'm a youth pastor, and that is where my passion is with young people. And every fall we talk about Baptist history. We focus on that first, and then in the spring we do theology or the Acts of Jesus. And it was really cool to see where we talked about the 4 freedoms and how it went from autonomy of the local church to autonomy of the person, and how for them that led to, well, what does that mean if people don't have the freedoms to say yes or no to the things that happen to them? And I mean, seeing them work their brains and saying, okay, well, it's more than just putting a black square in your Instagram on a Tuesday. It also means understanding why policies are the way they are. And this is from youth. And that makes me so excited, because that is where it begins, right? If we want people to have a foundation of, an advocacy, we want people to be passionate about advocacy, and we want them to have it founded on their faith. I think asking those questions about, why it's not just the broad picture, right? It's about the details. And so I think they both go hand in hand. And I think Steve is absolutely right that pastors have a really great privilege and honor of being able to use our power for folks to recognize that they have that power of people of faith, as people of faith.
Thank you very much. Danielle, the Black church in general, speaking generally, is no stranger to expressive prophetic advocacy. Talk about the interplay between that and kind of the long game, and how you see things from your vantage point as a minister of justice.
Yeah, so thank you for that. And I do think in the course, speaking broadly, we're not a monolith, of course, but I think historically, the Black clerical role that was introduced in Reconstruction really showed the ways in which pastors saw their role to be the both and, to not only care for those who were inside the congregations, but to take that voice into the public square, into state houses, into, Congress. So you have Reverend Hiram Revels, you have Bishop Henry McNeil Turner, right? All who took up space and understood policy, understood the importance of advocacy, and understood what does it mean to bring the issues to bear that African Americans at that moment faced, whether it was material impoverishment, violence, et cetera. So I think historically we have understood that role, but I would also say over time we have gotten away from that role. And I think many congregations have abandoned that to focus on either prosperity preaching gospel, or really being just caught up in conversion and instruction, really not getting away from what does it mean to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with God. And I think about the South African theologian, Dr. Alan Buzak, who said to walk humbly with God means to walk where God is walking in the world. Right. So for us, God is walking in many places. God is walking underneath the bridge in Dallas where the homeless are. God is walking over in Floral Farms where we have environmental racism taking place at this very moment, where many who are Black and brown are suffering, respiratory issues, who are on many medications where they were not on medications before. So for us, I think we attempt to, at least in the city, to demonstrate what does it mean to care about people's lives between Sundays. And that means then certainly to speak truth to power, to then ask the questions as to why do we have, 27 landfills south of downtown and none north of downtown? Like, that is intentional, that is planned, that's racist zoning. And how do we say that? And how do we use our voice, use our influence, and really show how our faith in action really comes to bear in that space, not just having a food pantry to give people food to eat because they're hungry. We must do that, but it's past that as well, right? It's why are they hungry? What do we need to do in the city, in the state, in the country to deal with hunger, particularly childhood hunger? In the city, in the Dallas County, you could fill Cowboy Stadium 3 times, and that would represent the number of hungry children in the county. So what does the church have to say about that? It's not just giving families food, it's digging a little more deeply than that as a pastor. And so if we are to really live out that mantra to do justice, love, mercy, and walk humbly with God, we have to go into those places and not just do charity, but to do justice and to ask the right questions and to, what I say, confront. And then we can determine if we need to go into this work in confrontation or in collaboration.
There you go.
Right. So that dictates the tools, strategies, and tactics you use in relationship building, the coalition building that needs to take place. So for me, I think historically that has been our role. That's how we survived. That's how we made it. And then just over time, we have gotten away from that. And for me, and that's the Proctor Conference, that's part of the remnant as we look at it, where some pastors like, we need to find that remnant who believe in prophetic preaching, who believes in prophetic ministry. What can we do? And that was really how the Proctor Conference was birthed over 17 years ago. Those who want to stand in that prophetic tradition of a Dr. King, of a Jarena Lee, of a Prathia Hall, right? So that's kind of how we see that role. And we try to live that out every day in the city and wherever else our voice is needed. We certainly don't limit it just to the city of Dallas, but certainly wherever we see injustice, material impoverishment, we go there because we just believe that where we see a thread of hope or where life is threatened, that's where we ought to be. It is not enough to leave the situation just giving some charity. It's that, and what do we do to deal with the root cause of the problem?
Absolutely. That's great. In these particular political times, Christians can find a lot of reasons to be politically active, right? They can have a lot of convictions that they personally bring to bear on politics. But in our work in CBF advocacy, we're saying as a congregation, not as individuals, as a congregation, the best place to start is in the mission work you're doing. So just like you're saying, Danielle, we ought to be out there in the community, doing that good mission and charity work, loving our neighbors tangibly, but also then starting from there, think systemically and move towards from that missions to advocacy. And so, Danielle, I want to start back with you. I heard you mention several things. I know you and I met almost 10 years ago now, working on payday lending, predatory lending. I think it was 2011, the legislative session there in Texas. And so I know you care about that, but you mentioned environmental justice, environmental racism. I know I've heard you work on food deserts and the hungry. So then, how do you take that lens and that understanding you have, and how do you face back towards the congregation as their minister of justice? What do you do in the church? What do you see your role in the church to encourage and promote advocacy?
Yes, I think the first starting point for me, and this is obviously done very well by Dr. Haynes, right? But it is, because I'll talk about French West, but I also want to talk about the church in general. Howard Thurman says, and I'm paraphrasing, many and varied are the interpretations of the teachings in the life of Jesus of Nazareth. But very few of these interpretations have something to say about the teachings in the life of Jesus to those who stand at a moment in history with their backs against the wall. So for me, it always comes back to what Jesus are we preaching and teaching about? And to go back to, I think, was said earlier, I think she mentioned that Jesus flipped the tables over in the temple, right? When we think about when he went, what was Jesus doing? Jesus was revolutionary in that act, in as much as when he flipped the tables over, he was disrupting an economy that was exploiting people. And so for us, it's all about, from the congregational standpoint, What Jesus do we present? How do we read the text from the bottom up? How do we present a Jesus who cares about those whose backs are against the wall? And then what does Jesus have to say about that? How does that then speak to our faith? And then how do we move beyond Sunday morning to go out and do the work of justice? And so for me, it's about making sure we have the right interpretation of Jesus, making sure theologically in our hermeneutic is about from the bottom up. How do we see that as people who are struggling, right, against oppressive systems? And so then once we kind of understand theologically where we all stand, then it's like, well, now what do we do then? How do we deal with, you say food deserts, we call it food apartheid, right? Because deserts are not man-made, that's nature. But food apartheid is, it's a production, it's intentional. So for me, it's about, okay, now that we know that we are in a food apartheid, what can we do as a congregation? Where can people fit into this food justice work that we do? So for me, it's important about one, theologically, do we theologically understand what we're doing, why we are doing this? And then it's, okay, here's how you can engage in this work. Everybody won't engage and have the same entry point. Some people may feel more comfortable with helping in the garden to grow food. Others may feel comfortable signing that letter, calling that elected official to ask for them to put a circle of protection around food budget items. Others may feel great about how do we advocate for children to have access to food in this moment of COVID, where we're anticipating a shortfall in food, as well as the city, the city running out of food, the county running out of money to supply food for children, right? So for me, it's about, then we sit down and we try to train and teach what does it mean to engage in advocacy work. So we use various ways to do that. We work with Texas Impact, for example, with B. Moorhead and her group. We have them come in and do an advocacy training session. So it's various ways that we actually train people on how to take your faith and put it into action, but also understanding that this is a long distance race. It's not a sprint, that we have to be really in this struggle until the end, if you will, to use the language of King, that this is an ongoing struggle that we have to fight because we're trying to uproot systems that are very deeply ingrained, and attitudes too, right? It's also how we have to learn to shape and create counter narratives, because oftentimes, at least how I view the work when it comes to policy, a lot of this has to do with who's deserving and entitled. Somewhere, some narrative is written or given to say this group is entitled to this group is not entitled to this. So it's all about also how do we create the proper narrative to tell the story that will then, we hope, will move people to have a change of heart to then pass the right policies that will not, that will make sure that people are not, find themselves really up and against systems that create material impoverishment and harm. So that could be either physical violence or structural violence, because we also see, lack of food and hunger is a form of structural violence, which is just as important to address as physical violence that we now see people protesting in the streets as relates to police brutality, right? So it's always trying to educate, and train people and show them that this is a journey and how we take this journey together, and how what we believe by way of our sacred text, how that grounds this work. But we also have to do the work of reading a newspaper, watching the news, asking questions and thinking critically about issues so that we can come up with the proper solutions on how we want to get to our end goal of what we're going after, whatever that goal is. If it's, like for Shingle Mountain, for example, I mentioned the environmental racism. We're trying to get that toxic waste removed, and we're still in that fight. 2 years, 18 months later, we're still saying these people are dying and we want the shingles removed immediately. So, we're still in that fight. So we're trying to get people to see the connection between, if you are Christian, we are then caretakers and we should care for God's creation. All of God's creation, the people who dwell within the earth and the earth itself. And so what does it mean for you then as a member of Friendship West to understand what the people are going up against over at Shingle Mountain, how that's impacting their health, and how you can call your city council person and say, this is toxic waste, this is inhumane, this is immoral, we need the shingles removed immediately.
Yeah.
So I think it's just about giving folks opportunities to engage in the work, but also giving people the necessary tools and information to engage in what they have to do. So sorry it took so long. But
that's all right. That's okay. Yeah. Well, like I said, you got a big role there. You do a lot. I know that. So we appreciate it. Steve, I want to turn to you for a second. You've been at South Main almost 20 years, right?
Well, that's 17 years.
Okay, so 17 years. So And I know that you've been involved in advocacy in a number of things. I know you testified against or for non-discrimination ordinance in Houston. You mentioned your police, the work recently on police brutality, payday lending. South Main, I think it's fair to say, is a predominantly white, middle class to upper middle class congregation. Sometimes those aren't the most active when it comes to advocacy. So what do you see your role in the congregation as you, as a pastor, have also been out in the community?
Yeah, I think part of it is to be the storyteller. It turns out, I think we have inside us an innate hunger for justice and fairness. John Claypool used to say, even a thief thinks stealing is wrong when he's the one being robbed. So when you can tell the stories of injustice that are happening in the community, there's a sense of violation. So, when I got into payday lending work, no kidding, I didn't know what payday lending was. And it was happening right around us. And so you called and said, hey, there's this meeting and it's right down the street from your office and I'm supposed to be there and I can't. It's really important. Could you just go and take notes so I'll know what happened? It was a great sucker punch move. So I went to this meeting and they're starting to talk about this thing and I'm trying to look like I'm not a dummy and taking notes. And the more I'm putting together what was actually happening, I'm like, wait, this can't be right. This can't be happening in our community. And so as I learned more and became more offended by that, then I just started asking people in the congregation, do you know anybody who's had to take out a payday loan? And most people, the demographic of our congregation is not their target market. But people would say, oh, there's a guy who worked for me, or there's this woman in our office. And I would ask them to tell the stories at Wednesday night supper. And suddenly it's a part of our community. And it turns out like this payday lending for us was not a partisan issue. There is not a Democratic argument or a Republican argument for charging poor people 800% interest. Like it's just evil. And so every week, early in my tenure at South Main, maybe like 04 or 05, we did a vacation Bible school that was built around the Lord's Prayer. And so we started praying the Lord's Prayer every week in worship because we thought it would help our kids memorize it. Well, if you start that, like when is the appropriate time to not pray the Lord's Prayer anymore? So like every week for about 15 years, our people have prayed, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And I don't know how you pray that and then see injustice and not do something about it. We talk about text. It's not just the minor prophets, it's the little brother. James says, when he's talking about faith and works, you believe Jesus is the Son of God? Great. Even the demons believe that and they shudder. If your faith doesn't have action, if it doesn't shape the way you live Monday to Sunday, if it's not advocating for the world in which we live to order itself the way that God wants it to be, it's hard to make a case that it's biblical faith. Mm-hmm. So I think my job is agitator. I think if you tell the story in a way that gets under people's skin, if they see that that's not right, then they want to know, is there something we can do about that? And it turns out, you have done an incredible job of ramping up from basically nothing to a really robust program. Here's a toolkit. Once you get to the stage of that's not right, what can we do about it? There really are very practical things we could do. And I would say not least among those is getting a partnership with a church whose race is different than yours. Dr. King is still right about that. 11 o'clock on Sunday morning is still the most segregated hour in America. And there are people whose lived experience is radically different than that in my church. The Pew research said in June of this year, as we were doing our work on police reform, if you survey people across the country and you ask them, have you ever been pulled over by a police officer when you did nothing wrong and had a gun pulled on you? 9% of white people in America say, yeah, that's happened to me, which means in my congregation, like at least on average, 9 out of 10, but I'm just saying it's like 99 out of 100 say, no, that's never happened. That just sounds so foreign to my experience. It's 31% of African-American women and 59% of African-American men say, yes, that's happened to me. So I just started asking African-American men in our congregation, have you ever had that experience? And the stories just start to flow. You tell those stories, and then partners in major law firms say, we had a Zoom call of all of our partners, and we just asked African Americans in our partnership, people that we work with, that we count on, that we respect, would you tell us your stories of injustice? And suddenly these aren't stories about them and they. They're stories about we and us. And people say, that's just not right. And so once you get people to that's just not right, they're primed for, okay, what do we do about that? Because Danielle, that's exactly right. How do we walk humbly and how do we love justice? We pray thy kingdom come, and we say, show me your faith by your deeds.
Thank you, Steve. That's powerful. Both of you all have lifted up, both Danielle and Steve lifted up the power of story. And that's incredibly important. I agree. It's part of, in addition to rooting our advocacy work and mission, because the church will know something about the issues facing the people they're working with in their community. You also learn stories, and stories are powerful, not only to onboarding your congregation into advocacy, but they're powerful to policymakers. It's one of the tools we have that you can sometimes break down a partisan divide or break down reticence to hear something if it sounds like a different party. When you tell a story of someone you know, a face and a name that you know, it's a powerful advocacy tool for the systemic change necessary as well. And Elisa, I'm going to go to you. For CBF, part of one of the three core things we do in our mission work is immigrant and refugee communities. And Elisa, I know you have a strong heart for immigrants. You've been active in some of those issues. And as you said, you're kind of in this different context, right? In Washington, D.C. and in young people. And so I would love to hear you say more about some of the things you've done in particular through the church when it comes to maybe immigration.
Yeah, so before I moved to DC, I was in Dalton, Georgia, which is about 2 hours north of Atlanta. And you would think you were in South Texas. 30% of the population is Latino. And there was a big boom, I think, in the 80s. And then again in the 90s, working in the carpet factories, because Dalton was once known as the carpet capital of the world. And I think in that, when I was the pastor of missions and community, I was able to partner with a lot of nonprofits in the area who were working with the immigrant and refugee community in Dalton. And I think you're right. Understanding the story, understanding story and hearing story, I think made the act of advocacy, it gave me more of a precision than, oh, we need to do this, 3-month series on why we need to love the immigrant. Like, well, yes, that, and these are the specific needs that our community needs right now. The very fact that it takes hundreds of dollars to apply for a green card or to reapply for DACA, those are fees and amounts of money that, at the last minute, I don't have $700 or $750 to give, to say, here's money that I can give you for, renewing whether you think I'm worthy to stay in this country or not. And understanding those specific ways of what the need is with refugees and immigrants in the States. And so I think here in DC, again, such a place with many opportunities to learn and to be a part of the work. DC has been, for me, a place of growing and always learning about my own privilege as a Mexican American who was born here and has the privilege of education and of monetary resources and all of this, and then recognizing the other aspects of advocacy that involve other organizers telling their stories that are more powerful and have a different experience than mine. And I think DC has been a place that has been at the epicenter of really challenging I think there's a young college student that who I mentor. She kind of mentors me, where she challenges that. She calls it the nonprofit industrial complex of, what happens when it just becomes this, this conglomerate of, we're here to save the people. And, we forget that you're not saving anyone if you're not putting skin in the game, because people who are doing this when their lives are on the line, that's skin in the game, or that their lives are on the line. And so learning from that, I think has at every step of the way has challenged me to check my own privilege as a person, wanting to be an advocate and doing it well. And then always asking myself, how am I hurting, or how am I harming, and how am I doing this well? And I think DC has been a really great place of learning that and kicking my butt when it's need to be kicked about, when do I need to shut up and when do I need to talk?
That's a great point, and something I'm always cognizant of, especially as someone who's been, fortunate enough to kind of carry around a lot of privilege in this country. And so, when do you use that? When can it be used for benefit, and when do you step back? And so, in teaching about advocacy, we want to say that we're not advocating on our own behalf, right? We're not trying to get the best deal for our churches or whatever. We want to advocate on behalf of the vulnerable and the marginalized. And sometimes I hear people say we want to do it for the least of these, and I think, yeah, that's I get that, it's biblical, but let's work on our language a little bit. And so it's not always about speaking on behalf of others. It's about passing the mic. It's about raising their voice, helping folks understand, no, here's where you yourself can tell your story and be powerful and and make a difference. And so that's hard sometimes, but I think you're exactly right. It's very important.
And I think, so if I could just say one thing.
Yeah, sure.
So Dr. Shaniqua Walker-Barnes, she was my pastoral care professor and women's theology professor at McAfee. Amazing. And again, talk about kicking my butt theologically. So I remember hearing her talking about when we talk about empowering others, and even that phrase in itself is this like privileged thing of saying, you have no power and I'm going to give you some, and reminding ourselves like, no, people have power. And so our jobs are to step aside and let it shine and let it thrive. And I feel like that has been a big reframe for me. When we talk about, the least of these, or the language that we use.
Yeah, or sometimes you hear a voice for the voiceless. No, yes. They have a voice. They are just silenced or ignored. And so help us, again, pass the mic, help amplify those voices. So, man, this has already been a great conversation. And you've all hit on sort of the theological root, it sounds like, to where you all find that. So I won't ask that question specifically, but let's say, I want to back up and say, there's somebody watching right now who this isn't part of their church. They feel the call. They know they should be doing something, but they don't know where to start. Hopefully our toolkit and Danielle's book can help. But why? Tell in a quick answer, why should the church get involved in advocacy when we know talking about things that are political can be risky and divisive, but why should they do it anyway? And Danielle, I'll start with you.
Okay, I guess I'll just give a short, because that's can be a lengthy answer.
Sure, absolutely.
But I think one of the reasons why we should is because what does it mean to be human? Right? So I think that's where it starts. Because when we're talking about being involved in advocacy, we're saying that because somewhere in here, we're seeing a breakdown in our society, right? Where some are not receiving care, and that could be in a number of ways. So I think for me, it's about, you need to be involved in advocacy, because I think you have to ask yourself the question, what does it mean to be human? There's a Zulu phrase, sawubona, how they greet one another. And when you say that, it's simply saying, I see you, but not that I just see you physically, but I really see you as a divine spark of God. And therefore, I'm concerned about, do you have everything you need? Do you have access to life-giving, life-sustaining resources? And I think if we call ourselves to be Christian, how can we not be involved in advocacy? How do we not have our voice lifted up, amplified in a very public space? And I always tell people, it's not you go in and say, "Thus says the Lord," right? That's not what we mean. But it is about, really, for me, it comes back to, a Thurman again, right? What we call humanity has a name, lives on the street, was born, has a name, needs all the particular things that we need. So it's, for me, as a Christian, it's just as basic as that. And we can get into, theologically why we need to do that. But just foundationally, for me, it's about, what does it mean to be human? How do you see other people? Right. And do you see if somebody does not have it? And that's just Ubuntu too, right? That's also, if we think about Bishop Desmond Tutu, it's this the notion of Ubuntu. I am because we are because I am. So if I don't have, you should see yourself as you may have it. Therefore, you're not comfortable with me not having it, right? Yep. And I have to tell many people, because you had lunch today doesn't mean somebody else had lunch today. Right. So it's also getting out of our own privilege, because a lot of us really sit in a lot of seats of privilege when we make these statements, right, of why we should be advocates. Or the flip side is, you don't want to advocate until it hits you personally. Right. So that's the other side of this that we have to have a conversation about. And I have it quite often with people, that if we do this advocacy work right, we don't have to wait until you are impacted individually. So it also goes back to how we have to get rid of being so individualistic, thinking we don't need a community, that we don't need one. What does it mean to really have all things in common? If we think about the church next, right? What does that really mean for us to really go after that? And so we're still striving for that beloved community.
I was going to get there. I was looking back in your book, and that focus on individualism. I mean, especially, we got some Texans on this call. We talked about embracing this rugged individualism, but I'm afraid sometimes it's hyper individualistic, both society and faith, right? Where it's just me and Jesus, and neighbors nowhere to be found. That's problematic. And so I'm glad you mentioned that.
And I want to say, because that, to your point, but see, that's also in a lot of the songs and hymns that we sing. That's often in our Bible studies that we do. So, I mean, we have a lot of work to do to where we get ourselves out of that individualism, even in the church. Right. And what does it mean? Jesus bless me. I mean, So
Steve, what do you say to a pastor who says, I want to do this, but I don't know, it's tough. It's risky. Why do they do it?
I mean, besides because it's right?
Yes, we're going to have to go with more than that, unfortunately.
So there's a great story about Frank Pollard, who's a longtime pastor at First Baptist Jackson, Mississippi. And Frank had a friend, African-American pastor, and he called him on a Sunday afternoon at home and said, "Hey, I'm coming through town tonight. Do you have any time for supper?" And Pollard said, "Oh, that'd be great. Let's have it. In fact, since you're going to be here, why don't you preach for me tonight? And then I'll take you to supper afterwards." Well, in the history of First Baptist Church, Jackson, Mississippi, there had never been a black man behind the pulpit. And just nobody told Pollard that. So the next morning, Pollard, everything was fine and polite that night. Next morning, Pollard's in his office, and a key businessman in the church came in without appointment, walked in without asking, and said, "If that ever happens again, not only will you not be the pastor here, you won't be the pastor anywhere." Do you understand what I'm telling you? And Pollard said, "Yes, sir. And I know who you are. And I'm afraid of you. But I'm more afraid of Jesus." And the story is that the color drained out of the businessman's face, and he walked out of the room. I'm all for a good community argument, but if somebody is starting in hyper individualism, start here with them. One day you will stand in judgment. And do you want to be judged for this? Because it seems to me Jesus is pretty clear about how the world is supposed to be and who the king is. So the hard answer is, because this is what Jesus tells us to do. I think the better answer is, not the better answer, another answer is, a softer answer is, I think you will find a vitality in your ministry and in your preaching when it actually finds life on the road. When you build friendships with people who aren't like you, and you discover things in their lives that aren't right, like that's how we discover privilege. Like, we're not good at seeing it in ourselves. But when somebody tells their own story and you think that's that's not how my life goes, then I think you'll want to engage. And I think to the extent that you can facilitate that experience for others, you don't have to, I mean, you just let it happen. C.S. Lewis said, you don't defend the truth, you let it go. It's like a wild lion. It hadn't been tamed. It will do its own work. You just have to facilitate the moments where people can see it and experience it and internalize it themselves. And then I think things will proceed from there. We talked about a story in my own life that I told at South Main 2 weeks ago. Normally, when I tell a story in a sermon, it's because I want to make a point. And I told them 2 weeks ago, I have a story and I don't know what the point is. It just makes me uncomfortable. But I don't want to be the only one who's uncomfortable with it, because I don't think that's going to help our church. So let me tell you this story. So, and here's the story. And let me tell you the same thing I told my congregation, which is, when I started the story, I said, look, some of you are going to think I'm telling this story to tell you how to vote, but I'm not telling you how to vote. Like, that's not the point. I don't know what the point is. The point is, the reason I'm telling you is I had an experience that I think we all ought to share. Like, that's what pulpits let us do. So here's my story. I got a call from Don Odom, who's the Minister for Social Justice at Wheeler Avenue Baptist Church in Houston. It's a storied African-American church in 3rd Ward, Houston, just blocks from our congregation. And he said, so he emailed, we set up a time to have a Zoom, and he said, I'm so glad I got your time. He said, I needed to talk to a progressive white minister. And I said, do you need me to find one for you? And he, because y'all, and he said, no, it's you. And I said, what makes you think I'm progressive? And he said, because at the Floyd service, you said racism is the reversal of the word of God. And I said, is that the bar for progressive now? Because that seems really low to me. And he said, well, then before we start, let me just make sure that you and I agree about one thing. Okay. He said, so you would say that white supremacy is wrong. And I said, yeah, yeah, it's a sin. It's antithetical to the gospel. Like, that's the gimme. And then he asked me, and it was an honest question. He said, do you know any other white ministers who think that? And I said, Don, you are hurting my heart that you even asked that. Yes, all of them. Everybody, I mean, there's some knothead somewhere who doesn't think that, but I don't know who that is. But like, everyone you can think of, they think that. He said, do you think they'll say that out loud? And I said, yeah, of course they will, but that's not what you want them to say. Like, that's the one of a 1-2 punch. So tell me what the 2 is. And then let's not play games with people, because I think we're headed to something serious. And he said, so if you believe that white supremacy is wrong, and you believe that we're brothers because we're in Christ, don't you have to say that you can't vote for a racist or a white supremacist? And I said, yeah, Don, like, we're not going to say that. And it pains me to tell you this, but in white churches, like, we don't invite politicians to come in and speak. We don't tell people how to vote. We have a really strong compact in the church that we don't talk about politics that way. And there are a lot of good reasons we don't do that, not the least of which is we have all kinds of privilege already. But it dawned on me for the first time that a set of decisions that I had never questioned the assumptions behind, like these seem like good choices, suddenly have put us at odds with a whole branch of the church in the cities where we live. And I don't know what to do with that. So I told this story to the church because I don't know what to do with it. I'm not saying you have to lead people because you know everything. Just share the misery. Help other people be uncomfortable too. And trust that the Holy Spirit is going to do something through. I just believe God's going to take us to a good place. And so if my first rule is only the truth can bless you. So my job is to tell people the truth. And I trust that the Spirit is going to lead us into the truth. So it's that kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Steve. I watched the sermon. It was a great sermon and powerful story. And so thank you for sharing it. I asked Steve to share that story. And I don't intend for us to have a discussion or debate about the Johnson Amendment and endorsing or opposing candidates and all this sort of thing. But that last point I think is critical, Steve. The humility and the honesty to say we've got to face some of these things, and I don't have all the answers, but as a church, as a pastor, we got to move that direction. And so I appreciate that. Elisa, I don't want to presume your answer, but I think personally, I've seen that younger folks think their faith ought to speak to what's going on in the world. And so for me, that's one reason I give to tackle this in the church, is that, for the benefit of young folks. But for you, why take the risk? Why address advocacy in the church?
So when I graduated from seminary, spring of 2015, the day that they did the laying on the hands at McAfee, it was at the height of the riots in St. Louis, and or it was in Baltimore. The protests in St. Louis were in the fall. Baltimore happened in the spring. Black Lives Matter movement was really taking off. And I remember a dear mentor, person I looked up to, and a person who was helping us say, this is what a good resume looks like for a church, telling us, now y'all are looking for jobs right now, so just make sure you don't sound too radical. And then November 2016 happened, and look what happened. What being silent didn't really get us anywhere. And I think for me, as a woman of color who has grown up in predominantly white spaces, who's been told a couple of times, don't be so divisive when it comes to when you, by merely saying, hey, something's not right here. I think that for me, that was the tipping point of that is no longer, that cannot be the standard for faith leaders. And as a person who truly loves the Church of Jesus Christ, as a young person who truly loves the Church of Jesus Christ and wants to see people of faith really live that out, and wants to see young people wrestle with and sit with and thrive in that faith, I think there are parts of our faith that, if we are Easter people, we need to be okay with dying and rebirthing something new in our faith. Because I think, what Steve mentioned, hearing that story and hearing those questions and realizing I can't solve this right now. I think that names just how far deep white supremacy has seeped into our religion, into our faith. Not just white Christianity, but I would even say the Christianity of Latinos, and because it's where my faith came from. It came from people who said, hey, immigrant families, welcome to America, become Baptist now. And I think there are parts of it that, we really truly need to wrestle with, and then say, I need this to die, to rebirth something, to rebirth a new type of Christianity that has the kingdom in mind. And I think for young people, if we truly want young people to come to church and to be involved of the Church of Jesus Christ, we don't need, smoke machines. We don't need someone singing on the guitar. We need to be honest about who we are as a faith community and say we are truly trying, and we are trying to figure out what does it mean for us in our community to be the presence of God, or to join God in the community. And I think for young people, that's what we're looking for, is for faith communities to say, we recognize that singing our hymns and worshiping this way is not enough. We need to worship this way too.
Thank you, Lisa. I appreciate that. I also want to say, I've heard you sing and play on the guitar, and you're pretty good, so I don't want that to go all the way away.
I'm an MK. I had to learn how to do that.
That's right. That's right. Part of the MK job description. I feel like in some ways we are just getting started with this conversation, but we're going to have to start moving towards wrapping up. But I definitely wanted to talk some more about the intersection of race and advocacy. We've hit on it multiple times here already, but for me, you don't get involved in systemic advocacy in this country without coming to a point when you realize, wait a second, racism is at the heart of this discrepancy. Racism is at the heart of some of these systemic problems. And so I just want to encourage folks to recognize that and know that, and to make be conscious of it as we move into that. But each of your congregations is in a cross-racial partnership. And so I would love, as we close, just a minute or two about what that's meant for your church. Danielle, you guys are with Wilshire. Elisa, you've got 19th Street, First Baptist and 19th Street. And Steve, you're working with Church Without Walls in Dr. Ralph West. But Danielle, if you could just say a minute about, I've heard a lot of the Wilshire side, and some of that's in the book. But for you all, what does that mean? And then for each of y'all, for just a few minutes.
Okay, yeah. So I think for us, at least, the point of departure, I have to think about Eddie Glau's book, Begin Again. For us, the point of departure is dealing with the lie that has been told about America. Right? Just this idea, the lie and the myth of white supremacy. And I think for us in our covenant with Wilshire and how we work together, and I love the way we enter into that covenant work and how we still do that work, because it wasn't around pulpit swapping. It was about how do we sit down and have real conversations about, in the city of Dallas, just look at the historical analysis of the city and the ways in the intersection of race, right, class, like what has that done to the city, how it's been programmed to be that way, how some of those same old systems are still intact, even with brown and black faces in leadership. Right. So for us, I think our partnership has been very rich and has really deepened the bonds of fellowship, because we are having those difficult conversations and very public conversations with congregations. And we usually do every King Holiday weekend is our main event we do together, where, folks from Wilshire, folks from Friendship West come together, and Pastor Mason, Pastor Haynes will oftentimes do a dialogue with one another. And we talk about the theology of King in various ways, where we reclaim the King, not the King that Toyota, Ford, and Walmart give us in 30-second commercials, right? But the King who, toward the end of his life, was calling this nation to the carpet, right, on being built on white supremacy, not dealing with the real issue, the lie that has been told over and over again that folks have bought into, right, both black, white, and otherwise, right? Internalized racism, as well as the racism that we even see now, right, is being unleashed, which is another form of fear and terror. And so I think for us, it is, let's talk about it. Let's be honest and real about it. And I love Pastor Mason because he's not shy about talking about it in his own pulpit to his own congregation, because that's where it starts. The conversation about, how do we deal with racial justice is not about black folks talking to white folks. It's white folks talking to each other. Right. Yep. A lot of this is your work. It's like your work to do. Right. But we're on this journey together, but it's not always us sitting down, guiding this conversation. And that's what I love about our partnership. I love it just about how we come together. And I love the way that Dr. Haynes and Dr. Mason have come together. And prior to the covenant, they had already started forging a friendship when they met at Trayvon Martin rally. Pastor Mason just felt led to be there, and he connected with Dr. Haynes, and they began to have conversation. They agreed, no pulpit swapping. We're going to have real dialogue, real conversation, and nobody is judged. Like, it's not about judgment, but it is about truth telling, right? That's how you get to racial reconciliation. It has to be rooted in truth telling. And I believe Curtis Paul, DeYoung, and Buzak in their book, Radical Reconciliation, was saying that it's real and it's revolutionary, right? It's like 4 things they say what it is. And I think that's what has made our work stronger. And we've also gone to Austin together to do, the day at the Friendship West Day at the Capitol. We all come together and do that together. So when we do activities and events together, it's not just for a photo op. We also do the tough work of having real conversation and feeling comfortable enough, safe enough to say how we feel, and no one feels like, if I say this, I don't want to be judged or seen as racist, but that's why we're here to talk. Because we say, if you're here, then you're trying to be a part of the solution. So we're not judging, but we can only do that if everybody's going to be honest about what they think and how they feel, so we can move forward. And so we continue to address some of the issues together in the city. And I think that's where it starts. And I think Steve's story is also a very powerful way in which that begins too, right? And just being honest, I don't know what to do, but I know we have to do something, but I can tell you how I feel. I mean, that's a great start, because you have to start somewhere. And I think if we're honest, truth telling, and as Christians, and we believe we are one body, right? Then we have to do that work internally. Because I think outside our young people, and I'm so glad Alyssa mentioned young people, because for me also, and particularly with our black youth, we have the added challenges of not only being advocates, they want to see what are we doing, but it's having to deal with the trauma that they constantly face as Black youth. They're traumatized. They only see Black bodies right in the streets being killed, right? So it's also this added thing that we have to deal with this soul trauma that they are experiencing while trying to say we must do better for the future. They deserve better. And how do we even, and we try to do a really good job of having our youth be a part of this. Not that they're on the sidelines, but they're very much involved in what we're doing. They advocate, they read up on policy. They help us think through, critically thinking, what should we do? What do you all want to do? They have an equal voice at the table. I think the table just has to be expanded. So yes, I think that's what's very important. And we just have to engage in truth telling, no judgment, be honest about that, and root that in scripture, right? How we see the scripture together, and then how that translates into action. Because I think that's what people need to see as the church.
A tag team on that.
Sure, Steve.
One of the things Danielle said, I think, is really wise. Friendship West is appreciably larger than Wilshire, in the same way that Church Without Walls is appreciably larger than South Main. There are more similarly sized churches that might have made good partnerships, but what happened was their pastors became friends. And I'm convinced that's how this has to start. So to your question to a pastor, like, how do you start? Call a pastor in town and say, could we have lunch? And at lunch say, I don't know where this is going to lead, but I'm wondering if we made a commitment to have lunch once a quarter, once a month, some periodic interval, and let's just get to know each other. Let's talk about our wives and our kids and what drives us crazy about the deacons and what do we love about our churches, and just get to know each other. Like that's everything. Look through the Gospels and see how many times Jesus is at a table, when they were breaking the bread and when they were passing the fish and when they were sharing the salt. I mean, something happens when we're around a table. And what will happen is, as you become more comfortable with one another, that comfort transmits to your congregations. If you start with a pulpit swap, everybody knows that y'all are strangers. But there is an ease and a familiarity among friends. And we're not just friends, like we're brothers and sisters. So it ought to be easy to get close. So if you start that work, and you might be surprised, I say that the size differential, because you might be surprised at the stature of folks in your community that will take your call because nobody else called. And so you start that relationship, and then you start thinking, now what could we do together? And Danielle, I agree exactly. I don't think a pulpit swap is the first thing. So for South Main and Church Without Walls right now in this crazy COVID season, I mean, Ralph West and I have known each other for 9 years. We met because we were invited to go together to a Truett trip to the Holy Land, and we were the two pastors in residence. That's about as idyllic as it gets. Harvey Clemens is the pastor at the Pleasant Hill Baptist Church here in Houston, and he reached out to me because my predecessor buried his predecessor. They were such close friends. They entered into a pact that whichever died first, the other preached the funeral. And he didn't want that story to get lost in the memory of our church. So we just started getting to know each other. We traded cell phone numbers. And when weird things happen in town, we call each other. And so when all of these other things have come together, if you know somebody, suddenly the possibilities of what you might do spring to mind because you have a relationship. So I'd say if you don't know, and it has to start with the pastor. Like, I'm all for youth groups getting together and doing things. I'm all for adult Bible study, which we're doing right now. But if your pastor isn't bought in, none of this is going to work. So if you're a pastor, if you're the senior pastor of a church, you are structurally empowered to make a difference. Reach out and start a relationship and say, look, what they say, the best time to plant an oak tree is 50 years ago. Second best time, right now. So call and say, hey, I don't know where this is going to go, but could we just start meeting and see if God wants to do something through us together? I think you'll be surprised. I think you'll be pleased. I think you'll be humbled by what God does with that.
Thank you, Steve. Lisa, I think your churches are in a little bit younger of a partnership, but I've heard some powerful stories of the history of the church and some things you've done together. You might say a few things y'all have done.
Yeah, absolutely. So our like Stephen said, our relationship is a little younger. We officially kind of went into our covenant in 2018, late 2018, I believe. And while we were kind of leading up to the talks of creating an official partnership, a historian who was doing a book research on Ford Theater, had to do some on our church, and discovered that our founding pastor enslaved people. And essentially, when someone tried to escape to freedom, he was sold back down to the slave trade in Louisiana. And that was our founding pastor. And that was not in our records. I mean, it took one person leaving it out to never get back in there again. It was somebody who was doing research on something else who told us. And so our relationship with 19th Street Baptist, which is on 16th Street, which is great because they're up the street from us. There's a history there with 19th Street, and so I think 2018 was the year our congregation had to sit with the reality of what happens when we erase history, or when it's erased for us, and when we miss it. And the dangers of that, and then also how it truly harms our faith communities. And so it has been really good for our church to enter into this fellowship with 19th Street, both as co-laborers of really truly asking, like, what is it that we need to do for our community? What does it mean to be 19th and First Baptist on 16th Street, just 6 blocks and 12 blocks away from the White House? And what does it mean to be a white church in partnership with a Black church? And how do we do this well? When do we listen, right? And when do we tell each other, hey, shut up, we need to listen? And I think one of the most beautiful things I've seen our churches do together, a couple of things, but one of them was when there was the White Supremacy March back in August of 2018, taking place on Farragut Square, just in front of the White House. Our churches had anti-protest in its own way. They offered a communion service in front of Dr. King's memorial. I was not able to go. I watched it on Facebook Live, but it was a really powerful moment, I think, for 2 historical Baptist churches in DC with a long history, and sometimes a hurtful history, to come together and say, we're creating a new covenant, and this is what it means when we gather at this table. And so in the last few, in June, we gathered each Friday and had memorial services in honor of George Floyd's memory and life. And I think there are more ways as we, continue to live through these COVID days and beyond, asking ourselves, what does it mean to be partners in these days? And so it's been really exciting to be part of that.
Well, thank you. It dawned on me, actually, after you've all accepted my invitation, that you're not only doing advocacy work, you're doing racial justice work, and I don't think that is an accident. I think those things are hand in hand, and so I appreciate you giving a few minutes to that. And now we're over time, and I was a little afraid this would happen because I could go another hour, but y'all didn't agree to that, so we probably need to stop. But thank y'all so much, Danielle, Lisa, Steve. This has been a great conversation. I am grateful for each of your friendships and for your time here today. I think you've been a great example for folks. And I want to invite everybody to continue us with CBF in our conversation series. We've got several coming up, some on missions work that Ellen Seacrest and our staff will be hosting, some on immigration and looking at immigration in the Bible and through Scripture that Elket Rodriguez will be a part of. And then 2 more on advocacy in the local church, one with some pastors to address specifically how do you get over the concerns that may come up in a congregation, how do you address concerns, and then finally on the 22nd with field personnel, several CBF field personnel units talking about how they see advocacy as critical to their work. So thank you all once again for joining us. I appreciate it, friends. Y'all take care.
Thanks much.
Thank you.